have to move around our body in order to coordinate all sorts of different activities. In order for us to walk or to listen to something, to write something down, in order for our heart to beat, all of that requires communication between different parts of our body. And so the way that the human nervous system works is that our brain sends signals which travel down our spinal cord, which is long tissue, goes between our vertebrae, that carries the message. From there, nerves branch out to various parts of our body. And so the message from our brain can get to different parts of our body through that pathway, through the brain to the spinal cord, out to the nerves. At the same time, information from the other parts of our body, your eyes, your skin, your ears, comes into our brain using the same kind of pathway. Goes through nerves to our spinal cord, back up to our brain, where our brain can then sort of interpret it. Humans have well-developed sensory receptors. We can hear things with our ears. There's special sensors to hear, to smell, to taste, to see, to feel temperature, to feel pain. All of those sensors convey that information to our brain. And that's what's shown here. So a stimulus is the word for some information coming into the nervous system. Receptors pick that up. Sensory nerves bring it to our brain and our spinal cord. And then if a response is required, then motor neurons can send a message to our muscles telling them to move. So a stimulus is a change in our environment, either on the outside or internally, that comes into our nervous system. Receptors are the structures that take that information. So we have receptors in our eyes, in our ears, in our skin, in our mouth, in our nose, that take that information in. And then they send that message around using what's called a nervous impulse. Works, like I said, on electricity and chemicals. This is why it's dangerous to be shocked or to be electrocuted, because that electrical signal can interfere with how our nervous system works. And when we talk about a response, we're talking about a reaction to a stimulus. So for example, if somebody tosses something to you, your response would be to catch it. Our nervous system is made up of special cells. This is what a single nerve cell looks like. This is called a neuron. And a neuron has these branches called dendrites that are listening for a signal, basically, from another neuron. They have this cell body, which has a nucleus and other organelles. And this would be the nucleus of that neuron. And then there's an elongated part, because a neuron's job is to take a signal from one place and bring it to another. The elongated portion we see here, that's called an axon. And at the end of the neuron are the terminal branches. That's sort of the end, and that's one complete neuron. Along the way, there's little bumps at the end of this terminal branches that have special chemicals called neurotransmitters, and they can release those chemicals. There's special insulating cells along the way, which allow the signal to be transmitted quickly, and that's sort of a fatty substance that helps that message to be sent. So when we look at a neuron, here we have one. Then the signal's traveling down this neuron from this side to this side, and that's happening through a mixture of this electrical and chemical signal. Once it gets to the end, once the nerve signal gets to the end of the neuron, these terminal branches, what happens is some chemicals get released. There's a gap between one neuron and the next. It's called the synapse. and the neurotransmitters are released. They bind to the next neuron, and then the message can be sent further on. A lot of medications and drugs work by mimicking the action of these neurotransmitters. Okay? And that's how lots of different medications work. Our central nervous system is made of the brain along with the spinal cord. And different parts of the brain do different things, right? Our different functions are controlled by different parts of our brain, and doctors have been able to figure that out. They've been able to trace what the different parts of our brain are able to do. One part of our brain is responsible for speech. One part is where we interpret visual signals and so forth. So, can you guess, how did doctors figure out what part of the brain does what thing?
Okay.
No.
The poke.
That's one thing they can do now, but the first information they got about this was people that had brain injuries. They would look at, if a person had damage to a certain part of their brain, they would look and say, okay, well, what happened to them? What did they lose the ability to speak, or did they lose their memory? Did their emotions change? And by sort of coordinating that and correlating that, they sort of figured out over time what the different parts of the brain actually do. So the brain is really just nerves. Our brain is just a whole bunch of those neurons, which we just looked at, surrounded by a membrane, and there's some fluid between them. The largest part of our brain is called the cerebrum. Okay, that's like this front portion, all of this. And the cerebrum is where we interpret information coming into our nervous system: sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing. All of our senses are interpreted by the cerebrum. It controls our voluntary movements. So as you write something in your notes, it's your cerebrum sending a message down your spinal cord, out to the muscles of your wrist and your hand, telling them how to move. Our memory, our emotions.
Is that the frontal lobe?
Yeah, that's part. The frontal lobe is part of that cerebrum. All of those things are controlled by that large cerebrum that we have. If you compare the brain of humans and other animals, humans have a large cerebrum compared to the other parts of the brain. The base of the brain is called the cerebellum, and that part of the brain coordinates our motor activity, balance, things like that. It's the section down here. And then there's what's sometimes called the brain stem. It's almost the top of the spinal cord and the very bottom of the brain. This controls like our most basic life functions. The things that we need to stay alive, they're controlled by our brain stem, by the medulla. Breathing, our heart rate, our blood pressure, reflexes, coughing, blinking, those things are controlled by the very lowest part of the brain.
Is that why when that is affected by a disease, you have to be sent into an iron lung?
It could be. So sometimes, sometimes if you have a problem with your nervous system and you can't breathe on your own, like a person not an iron lung, but they might be on a ventilator, which mechanically makes them breathe in and out. Like, you've ever seen somebody...
Like when they first just had people in rows of iron lungs.
Yeah, that was usually due to other types of lung disease or polio sometimes. Yeah, polio interfered with how people breathe, and that would allow them to still stay alive even though they had breathing trouble. So just if you look at a few different vertebrates, you can see differences in the brains. You can see a human brain is mostly cerebrum, whereas in these other species, the cerebrum is much smaller.
The cat is very smooth.
Yeah, and it varies in terms of the folding and things like that. Here again is just another sort of side view. This is the cerebrum, this part of the brain. And then you have the cerebellum in the back and then you have the brain stem or the medulla. Those are the different parts. And here's a little map of like what each part does. So, different parts are involved in planning and smell and emotion and language and vision, and all sorts of different activities are regulated by this. And like I said, scientists now have a tool called a functional MRI where they can put somebody in an MRI machine and kind of watch how the different parts of their brain work, and then ask them to do different things. Ask them to sing a song, ask them to talk, ask them to remember something. And they look at what parts of their brain are active when they're doing those activities, so they're able to focus at very specific activities to different
Is that when
parts.
they glue those tabs to your head and then watch on the monitor?
That's looking at brain activity partially. Yeah, this is a different tool, but the same idea. Yeah.
I've had that happen.
Yeah.
It's annoying to get those out of your head, though.
Oh, really? Yep. So besides our brain and our spinal cord, there's the other parts of our nervous system. So this diagram shows this is the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. And all the other parts which branch out for that are these other nerves. And you probably know that if a person has a spinal cord injury, what happens?
Paraplegic?
Sometimes a person could lose the use of their legs. What else can happen?
Completely paralyzed?
Yeah, they can lose the use of their arms and legs. What determines that?
Which section is damaged?
Right. And what is a more dangerous injury? Higher or lower in the spinal cord?
Higher.
Yeah, higher. Because if you think about what that means, if a person injures their spinal cord up here, or let's say down here first, their brain could tell their legs to move, and the message goes down the spinal cord. But if there's damage, it gets to a blockage, and the message telling their legs to move can't actually get there. So their muscles work fine, and the nerves in their legs are fine, but they can't get the signal from their brain telling their legs to move. Also, they can't feel, right? If you prick somebody that has a spinal cord injury in their legs, the pain message would start to go up, but it gets to the break and it doesn't go to the brain. So the higher up you go, you lose the loss of more and more parts of the body. So, for example, if the damage happens up in the neck area, now the message to move your arms can't get there, or information from your arms and nerves can't get to your brain. So the higher up the injury is, the larger the loss of tissue, of use of different parts.
What if you have like a disc transplant?
So discs are different. So between the vertebrae, those bones are stacked on top of each other, and in between each one is a disc of cartilage.
Oh, I see.
And so they help cushion, but that's not actually nervous tissue. That's like part of your skeleton. So it could cause pain and things like that, but it doesn't cause. Well, I mean, if the discs swell, they could pinch the nerve and cause pain. Like a person has like sciatica, you may have heard of.
What if you get like the bone replaced, and therefore would the signals send again?
No, because doctors don't have a good way of healing our spinal cord. You can't sort of stitch it together. It doesn't grow together very easily. So that's something that's like a very common area of research is how can we either go around the damage to a spinal cord or encourage the tissue to grow back. Those are things that would be, if doctors could solve that and figure out a way to repair spinal cord damage, then they can help a lot of people that have had spinal cord injuries. There's another thing we have that are called reflex arcs. Now, if you ever touch something that was hot, like the stove, or you burn yourself, like you jerk your hand away before you've even processed that you burned yourself, right? And in fact, it takes if few seconds before you actually can feel it or it hurts. And that's part of this reflex arc. These work because they don't go up, these signals don't go to your brain. They go into your spinal cord and right back out to your muscles so that you can take your hand away from the hot item before the message has got to your brain that it's hot. And these are help protect us, right? That helps protect. If you touch something hot and then you had to wait for the message to get to your brain and then your brain had to tell your hand to move, then that wouldn't be, you could do a lot more damage to yourself if it took that much longer. So instead, we have some of these reflexes. Or when you go to the doctor, they might tap on your bottom back, below your knee, and you have a reflex which causes your muscles to contract and for your leg to kick out. That's another one. There's lots of different diseases that affect the nervous system. Okay, and that's some of these. Cerebral palsy is sometimes caused by damage during birth or during development, where maybe there was a part of the brain that was not getting enough oxygen during development or during the birthing process. And that could lead to problems when people have difficulty with coordination or speech, or different motor functions. But basically, once a portion of the brain is damaged in this way, it can't really be repaired. Sometimes people can have like physical therapy or other types of therapy to help improve their ability to do certain things, but you don't actually cure the problem. Meningitis is an infection of the lining of the brain. Sometimes people can get vaccinated against it. Often when people go to college, they might get a meningitis vaccine because it can be caused by a virus. And what happens is this virus inflames the lining of your brain and causes swelling. And that swelling can damage the brain. You may have heard about people having a stroke. A stroke is when there's a lack of blood flow to the brain for some reason. It could be a blood clot stopped the blood from getting there. It could be there was damage to a blood vessel. But again, if the brain isn't getting enough oxygen, enough supply of blood, then a person's ability to move or speak or memory could be impaired. And depending on how long that part of the brain doesn't have oxygen might determine how long-lasting or how extensive the damage might be. You just mentioned polio, Kate. Polio is a virus. We're all vaccinated against it now, so almost nobody ever gets polio anymore. But it used to affect millions of people. And it was a virus that damaged neurons that help control the body. So a person that had polio was affected, they might be paralyzed, they might have just general weakness, their muscles wouldn't develop properly, they might not be able to breathe, and that's where you're talking about the iron lung. Nowadays, really, like I said, nobody gets polio. We have a vaccine for it that works very well, and so it's pretty much a disease that we've been able to get rid of.
Right? Wasn't it FDR that had polio?
Yes, FDR had polio, yep, but he hid it. He didn't want anybody to know, so people would like disguise the fact that he was in a wheelchair or had any sort of impairment. Some other neurological diseases, MS, multiple sclerosis. The cause of this is unknown. Doctors don't really know exactly what caused it, but it breaks down the lining, the sheath, that insulation I mentioned, around the neurons. And so it interferes with how the neurons fire, how they work. And it could lead to a person, not having great control of their muscles. And sometimes there's medications that can help, but there's not really a cure.
The body sees itself as a foreign object and sort of attacks itself.
Yeah, like that's called an autoimmune disease. And there's lots of different diseases that happen because of that. Like autoimmune diseases can cause diabetes or lots of other things. Parkinson's disease is a common neurological disease. This is caused by a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is in the brain, and there's not enough of it. And so it leads to people having difficulties with movement, with their walking, or tremors. They might have a shake, a tremor. And again, there's no real cure for it. There's drugs that can help lessen the symptoms and things like that. Alzheimer's, you probably have heard of. So this is, again, a brain disease, which leads to dementia. It's basically the slow
process of the frontal lobe shutting down.
Yeah, it's the destruction. Neurons start to die up, and certain proteins start to build up in the brain. So people start to lose their memory or have dementia. And like it can lead to strange sort of loss of memory. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, and when she was, in her 80s, she could remember things that happened when she was a child, but she couldn't remember things that happened to her, that day or that week. So it's sort of a strange how it affects people's memories. Epilepsy is caused by either genetic disease, an injury. Sometimes the cause is unknown, but basically the neurons of the brain sort of just are firing randomly. And that can lead to what we call a seizure, when a person sort of loses control of their movement, of their body functioning. There's medications that can reduce.
Is it commonly from flashing lights?
What's that?
Is it commonly caused from flashing lights?
Yeah, so some people that have epilepsy, a seizure can be triggered by like strobe or flashing lights. That's why in video games and television shows and things like that, they sometimes have a warning that there may be flashing lights, because sometimes people with certain types of epilepsy have to avoid that. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so we're not going to move on to this right now. This is an activity you're going to be doing either tomorrow or on Friday, but you're going to explore a little bit of information about a few different neurological disorders or diseases. I'll just tell you a little bit about some of them to give you a preview. This guy is Clive Waring. He has what doctors call the worst case of amnesia ever. He had a virus that attacked his brain, and he lost his ability to make any new memories. So basically, he can't remember what happened a minute ago, or
I believe I've seen this.
Even 30 seconds ago. So he has a very strange sort of existence where he can remember.
He remembers one person, but every time they leave for like 30 seconds and come back.
Yeah, that's his wife. He knows that's his wife.
I've seen this.
And he knows who she is, but he feels like he's not seen her in decades or something like that. So each time she comes to visit him, even if it's, a day later, he feels like he hasn't seen her in ages, and he's so happy to see her. This one is a video that you might watch about a disease called SIPA, which is when a person has no pain receptors. They're born without pain receptors, so they can't feel pain. And that leads to a whole bunch of very difficult things, because pain is helpful to us, right? Pain is a sign that we're damaging our body in some way, that we're sick, that we have an injury. And when a person can't feel those signals, that can lead to some significant problems. And this is a story about a little girl with that disorder. And then the last one is about this gentleman. He is a person who had a lobotomy. And this video is about the doctor that kind of popularized lobotomies. In, let's say, the 1950s and early 60s, there was no such thing really as medications for any sort of mental health issue, depression or anxiety or personality disorder or attention deficit disorder. There weren't medications that could help people overcome some of those issues. And so one of the things that this doctor started doing was a surgery on people where he basically severed a part of their brain. And it changed people's emotions and personality and behavior, but it caused a whole host of other negative effects. And so they were popular for 5 or 6 years until people started to decide it was not really ethical to permanently alter somebody's brain with a surgery and sort of because they had certain behavioral issues that people were not did not like. So
Will we be watching any of these?
What's that?
Will we be watching any of these?
You're going to have your choice. So this activity is for you to have your choice of learning about one of these things. Yeah. Why do you have interest in one of them?
Mr. Clive.
Clive wearing that. It's an interesting
There was
story.
a movie out there, documentary.
Yeah, there was. There's a few of them. And this is a link to one of them. Yeah, there's some are really long, some are short.
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah. Because his story was interesting because he could still play the piano beautifully and read music and do all these other things. He used to be a professor of music. But again, because he doesn't remember 30 seconds ago, he feels like he's been unconscious all the time. And he feels like he's just awoken from being unconscious. And even though he wasn't, he just doesn't remember what was happening, for the last several years. And so that leads to him being disoriented and things like that.
I've never seen a video where a dude got a pipe launched in his head.
Oh, yeah. So that's probably Phineas Gage is a classic story about somebody. Phineas Gage was working on the railroad, building the railroad, and they used explosives to clear the land. And you'd drill a hole in the ground, you'd put some gunpowder in there and tamp it down with a rod, and then leave the area and they would explode it. Well, when he was tamping it down, it exploded and the rod went through his skull, under his eye, through his eye, he lost, and out the top of his head. And what people said is that after that, he survived. He was conscious. After this rod went through his head, he was still conscious. And they brought him to the doctor. And he survived the injury. But people said he was a different person after. His personality changed completely. He went from being a nice person, a kind person that had held a job his whole life. He was mean to people, and he swore all the time, and he started drinking, and all his behavior sort of changed completely after this injury to one part of the brain. And the part of his brain that was injured was part of the brain that controls emotions and things like that. So it's like I said earlier, one of the ways doctors learn about what part of the brain does what originally was by people that had injuries in different ways. So yeah, you can learn about those tomorrow or on